Hello, and welcome to Talking Insights, the new podcast series from Esomar. I'm your host, Shrika Govindaraju, and throughout this series, we'll be taking a closer look at the key topics of today, taking a step beyond the world of market research and insights to tackle the big questions of our time. After all, our sector deals with understanding and predicting the world we live in. So let's look behind the numbers and dive into the most important conversations of today that will shape our tomorrow. Historic disasters such as the Black Death, Spanish flu, and the Great Depression have all left an indelible mark on our societies and civilizations. Furthermore, decisions taken or not taken by countries and governments have had long-lasting repercussions in many parts of the world, lasting to this day. As the world contends with the prospect of life after COVID-19, what lessons can we learn from the past to help us build a better future? What changes will our society and economy undergo as a result of the pandemic? And what decisions and mistakes may come to help or hurt us in the future? Joining me today to further explore his Research World article, Guns, Germs and Beer, COVID Economy, What Comes Next, is Rex Briggs, founder and executive chairman of Marketing Evolution. Rex has a storied career within and beyond the data research and insight sector, developing cross-media research, which he championed alongside Bill Gates, and worked as director of research at Wired magazine. Rex serves on the editorial board of Research World and is a best-selling author of 2 books, What Sticks, Why Advertising Fails and How to Guarantee Yours Succeeds, which is required reading at both Wharton Business School and Harvard, and Surf's Up, the story of how algorithms and software are changing marketing. Rex, thank you for joining us today.
Shrikar, good to be here. Thank you.
So just to kind of start where your article starts, really, which is looking towards the past, looking to history, and these historic crises that humanity has undergone in the past. What parallels do you think we can draw from the current crisis to those of the past? Other pandemics or even economic crises like the Great Depression?
Yeah, well, the first place to start is to look at the underlying economic cycle. And this is the beginning of the Guns, Germs, and Beer article, is that in a normal economic cycle, you have a much more gradual move into a recession. And the recession begins to hit different categories, different dominoes begin to fall, and you slide into that recession, usually over the period of a couple of quarters. And then you're in that trough. The second phase of it is being in the trough of that recession, and then you begin to see green shoots and things reemerging and growing, and you grow out of that cycle. And we're all familiar with those economic cycles. In my career, I've gone through 3. This will be the 4th one, and we can look at a broader historical perspective on how markets react and respond. What makes a pandemic different is that it isn't just those 3 cycles, and the cycles play out a little bit differently. So the first cycle, which is that sliding into recession, isn't a slide; it is falling off a cliff, and that's exactly
more of a plummet than
exactly more of a plummet than a slide for sure. So that first lesson is that that shift happens very, very quickly, which means that government's response has to be equally quick to offset some of the impacts. In the US, we were looking at location data, and what we saw was people began to stay home before even the lockdown or stay-home orders came into effect. So people were already pulling back and saying, I'm not jumping on a flight. I'm not, taking mass transit if I don't have to. I'm not going to a restaurant. I'm not doing a lot of these activities that were happening prior because I now see enough infections in my area that I don't want to get sick. So that cliff is distinctive, and I'll come back to how different governments respond and what we do next. But the second thing that happens is that instead of that trough that normally works its way through an economic cycle, in the pandemic, that trough is really defined by how long it takes before you get to a place where people can go out again without feeling at risk. Mm-hmm. And that happens either when someone has access to a vaccine and that vaccine is broadly distributed, or when there's herd immunity. Which you look at that, how long that either of those things take with the numbers and the math, and it's very easy to see that takes at least a year to 2 years for that to play through. Mm-hmm. And so that actually creates this oscillation in the economy where you're just stuck in this trough where people are not willing to go out as much or spend as much and so forth. So some of the market research where Prosper Analytics asked, for example, what people are planning on spending and cutting back. They're cutting back on retail clothing, eating out, travel, etc. Sure, they're still spending on, as I point out in the title of the article, guns, things that clean germs, and beer.
Beer, of course.
Yes, exactly, and candy and
it's a necessity for a lot of people.
Yeah. So you have a different cycle, and you have to prepare yourself for that longer period of time where the economy won't turn around based upon its own steam, its own energy. It turns around because of an external health factor, which is either that herd immunity or access to a vaccine. So then you have the phase where you begin to climb out of the recession, and which is important, and that maybe lasts a year or so, maybe 2 years, and then what I think is really fascinating is this fourth phase, which is this long boom, which normally happens in economic cycles, and those can last from 6 years to 12 years. We're just ending a fairly long, gradual climb in the last economic cycle. And what I'm arguing is that during the 18-month period of time that we're in that second phase, we should be investing in long-term ways of building a better economy, and maybe one that is more green, so we can deal with climate and some of the other challenges that we have. Certainly one that re-educates the workforce and gives them the opportunity to learn new skills and new capabilities, so that we have a much longer boom on the back end of this cycle.
We will we'll come back to that a bit later on, because I do definitely want to pick up on those phases, of course, that you described in the article, and what the kind of measures that we can implement, or those in charge can implement to ensure more sustainable growth. But it's an interesting kind of note here. When you mentioned the economic cliff, there was a fascinating statistic which said that during the Black Death, how many hundred years ago now, one particular region of Egypt lost 98% of its taxpayers as a result of the pandemic. So I think even historically, you can see there are these just sudden snap declines, which no one can really foresee. But the other thing, of course, that pandemics do bring about is great change. And as we saw in the aftermath of plagues in the early part of ancient history, or during the Black Death, there was a large shift in political power, in social structure, in economic theory. So, in your perspective, do you think the current crisis that we are living through now is going to lead to any of these major changes to entrenched systems that we have of governance or of our economies?
Yeah, I think we will absolutely see social change. The big question that I wrote in my most recent article, where I talked about whether we were breaking good or breaking bad, is that we are at this break point. And right now, we could see the pandemic continue to decrease and get to a point where the virus is burning out and dying out. That's happening in many countries in Europe and in Asia and in most states in the United States. However, there's also the chance that instead of it breaking good and continuing on that trend, we break bad and we see a resurgence like what happened in the 1918, 1920, the so-called Spanish flu. That breaking bad, I think, is a very real possibility, which would probably drive more long-term damage to the economy and to society. But yeah, the things that you can expect to happen is that there's a shift towards less travel, less complex global supply chains. You can see that in the developed countries in Europe and North America, their ability to use monetary policy to offset that drop. We talked about that falling off the cliff and what governments can do in Europe and in most of the developed countries. the central banks have been very accommodating. Fiscal policy has also put stimulus back in the economy and bridged the gap around unemployment. In the U.S., there was a study from the University of Chicago showing that 68% of the people that were recently unemployed actually are making more with the combination of unemployment and stimulus than they would have continuing in their jobs. And that will last up until June when those extra stimulus benefits expire. But it really cushions the blow very significantly. But if you jump over to the developed world, they don't have that monetary policy options. So in Africa right now, where some of the countries are already beginning to struggle with food insecurity and more increased into the area of being at crisis levels according to the UN, and then the governments that are looking for aid. China is providing it and filling a bit of a vacuum created by the U.S. And unfortunately, they're also, in order to write those loans, they're having those loans guaranteed by the mineral rights in those countries. And so those long-term implications of the Belt and Road acceleration in helping cushion the blow for the developing countries, which don't have the same capability to print money that the developed countries have, I think will be very long-term implications. The Caribbean is a very interesting area to study, and there's a wonderful economist, Marla Duckharm, who has done some great work in showing how dramatically impactful COVID will be on the Caribbean economies and some of the risk and dangers of what may play out because they are so tourist dependent in many of the economies. Some of them, 80% of their economy is tourism. And her concern is that it leaves room for more narco trade and basically trading anything that can be sold, which unfortunately includes human trafficking and drugs and other I think other long-term harmful trends. So I think we are fairly focused on our own countries and our which is understandable, but I think we need to take a global view at what type of impact this has at redefining the global relationships as we look at trying to come out of this crisis.
Absolutely, I think once again to me that kind of it's a striking similarity to one of these kind of historical shifts in the axis of global power, where in the kind of 13 to 1400s the axis shifted away from Asia over to Europe, in the wake of another pandemic, and it's fascinating to hear that maybe we are on the cusp of something like that again, where this axis of kind of power and control may once again move to a different part of the world, depending on who plays their cards best during the crisis.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. By the way, I mean just to amplify that point, it is a choice of how we play our cards, and I think that when you look at the logical drivers or conclusions of what happens as this pandemic plays through, those are sort of obvious. I mean, more people will die. There will be more challenges in supply chains, and that will affect food supply and starvation. More, economic things like tourism. There's an estimate that 100 million people globally will be put out of jobs in the tourist industry because of the pandemic. And so you can go through different countries that are highly dependent, and you can logically see where the problems are going to be. What is the choice is how we play our cards, as you said, which is what do we do about that, and do we do nothing and let the power shift in a way, or do we proactively try to engage in a way to create a better outcome in light of the crisis? I mean, that's the choice in front of us.
Absolutely, and I think it echoes quite nicely one of the kind of historical moments that you outline in the introduction to the article, which was China's decision to burn its ships back in I think it was the mid 1500s. And you state in the article that this set back their kind of trajectory in terms of relations to the world by several hundred years. And here today, we're looking at China, which, as you say, through the Belt and Road scheme, is actively seeking to strengthen its global reach. So, how do you see How do you see that as this kind of action on the part of China or inaction on the part of other governments? Do you think that's ultimately going to be something beneficial or something that's kind of a decisive factor in how the world emerges from the crisis? Or is this kind of just an ongoing, geopolitical, economic sort of game?
Yeah, I think it's bigger than an ongoing background of the economic, geopolitical, trade war type tensions that have been existing. And this takes it to a whole another level and accelerates it. And so I think the key areas that I would focus in on is what's happening in data collection and AI. And China has made a very big investment in that area. And there's a great book, AI Superpowers, where an insider in the venture capital world shares what China is doing and compares to US. He's been both in Silicon Valley and in China, so has a very good perspective on that. And then you begin to say, if you look at that core base of what are the modern technologies, the next generation of technologies that accelerate the economy, certainly AI is a fundamental part of that picture. So when you then jump over and say, well, when China looks to bring its aid into different countries, what does that look like versus when the European Union or the US brings its aid to a different country? How does that affect the political institutions and the direction that those countries may go in? And I think that there is definitely a break point around the direction we go from liberal democracies and open economies and the China versus China's more authoritarian, capitalist hybrid. And my hope is that Western democracies lean in at this moment and recognize that the developing countries will absolutely need aid to bridge this gap. And they won't be able to use their own monetary policy the way that we will, but we can lend them money, or we can invest in their economies in building infrastructure in ways that deepen our open, democratic values. But I think that there's now truly a competing model where these different countries will have a choice. And frankly, if the U.S. doesn't step up or Europe doesn't step up to offer a choice, then the only choice is China's model.
Mentioning that the U.S. kind of offers this bridge. Another example you give in the article is the Marshall Plan, the famous Luftbrücke, in the aftermath of the Second World War, and how the U.S. kind of propped up or helped to rebuild the German economy, which ultimately led to this transatlantic partnership between Europe and the USA. But I think one of the areas where attitudes may vary between Europe and the USA is when it comes to questions of the economy. And the next question I kind of want to ask you is, what are the kind of drivers behind historic economic crises that we've seen? How many of them are we seeing again during the current COVID crisis? So a question of how much wealth is accumulated at the very top, how protected are workers, and questions. You mentioned AI and other technology. How have shifts in technology contributed to the kind of spiral that we might find ourselves in?
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there. The first one is your observation about the Marshall Plan is absolutely right. I mean, that was a transformative decision that has built long-term partnerships. And it's important to remember that the Marshall Plan was not the first plan that came out of the U.S. after World War II. There was a plan that was far more punishing to Germany, and it led to starvation, it led to frustration, and it was basically to try to push Germany back into an agrarian type of an economy rather than helping them move forward into an industrialized economy. And I think that the really important lesson there was that the U.S. recognized that was not working and said, the better strategy is to help countries advance forward into future economic opportunity. And if we look at some of the developed countries in that same way and help them make a jump forward in their economy, number one, it can diversify the risk of the supply chain being in China, and we can move some of the labor advantages that China initially offered to Africa and Latin America, and I think that can be long-term beneficial for everyone. The second part of the part about the inequality and what's happening in really almost all the countries that we've looked at is that if you have a college degree, about 60 to 70% of the people that have that college degree can work from home. I mean, you and I are doing this podcast both from the comfort of our home.
I'm sitting in my bedroom right now, so I think it's case in point.
Case in point, right? And many of the people that will listen to this will be in their homes listening to this, right? I mean, we have that freedom because we had the opportunity to pursue education, and we had the grit to follow through and complete that education. So that disparity is dramatic because if you don't have a college degree, it's something like 20 to 30%, depending on the country you're looking at, that can actually work from home. Most of those people have to go in to a physical place where they are more likely to become infected. And, really, if you think about the infections as just a mathematical consequence of how many people you are coming into contact with and how much infection is in that community, then it's pretty easy to see that if you have to be in a physical place and you can't stay at home and you're interacting with hundreds of people in a day, you're much more likely to get it. So I published an analysis on my site, speakerrex.com, which got zip code level data for the state of Illinois, cities like Chicago and New York, San Francisco, Las Vegas, Reno, Nevada, just to look at a cross section of different communities and different sizes. And the pattern was consistent across all of them. The zip codes or the postal codes, the neighborhoods that were infected were ones that were in the bottom third of the socioeconomic ladder. So a couple things happen, as you play that through. One is especially in the U.S. where the healthcare system isn't the same as most European countries, it will certainly be a social shift around the whole healthcare debate. The recognition that keeping people from getting sick or keeping them healthy is important to keeping the whole community healthy may play through in as one of the social changes that come about. But the other one is this question of, are we going to pair with a Marshall Plan type strategy for helping developing countries post-COVID? Can we also pair that with a GI Bill, which in the U.S. went hand in hand with the Marshall Plan, which was allowing people to go back to school, vocational school or college, and invest in their education. And this is the moment to do that because we know we're going to be in this oscillating economic downturn for about 18 months before a vaccine is broadly distributed or you get to herd immunity, which means that now's the time to encourage people and incentivize them to invest in a future set of skills that will be much more valuable than some of the service level skills that put them more in harm's way. And by the way, whose jobs are not going to come back overnight. I mean, tourism will not come back overnight. It just it takes longer for people to decide to travel again. Yeah, that's right.
I did want to touch on the COVID GI Bill that you did mention, because one of the discussions that I think has come up quite often, especially in the past 5 to 10 years, and I heard this a lot in the UK as well when I was growing up, is a question of reskilling or upskilling, people who are older in the workforce who, they've had their training and education before the advent of things, the internet, doing everything online, or, as we're doing now, speaking remotely, teleconferencing, everything else. And it's that you're providing support to people to get active in the economy again by retraining, by learning, developing those technical skills that you do require. Do you think, as you propose the COVID GI Bill, do you think the pandemic will be a driver to push something like that through? Like, how realistic is it that, from your perspective in the US, that the US government will push for a program like this?
I think it will be harder in the US. I think Europe should do more in that area and probably can get more done. And individual countries in Europe need to, will make their own policy decisions. But here's why it's important. First of all, let's recognize that not everybody who is offered to reskill will raise their hand and do it. And let's also recognize that not everyone will decide to become computer scientists, which is where we need the most jobs. I mean, it's really hard. But there is a huge range of different opportunities available. I mean, you can look at clean energy and look at all the different people that in the Reno, Nevada area, that when Tesla came in with their first gigafactory, went through vocational training to get the skills to be able to work in that gigafactory. You can imagine the same thing happening as Germany's building, their gigafactory, and you can imagine all the solar installers and all the other skills which can take people who maybe have a more of a mechanical intelligence and offer them a pathway to a skill that's more in line with the future economy. And then, of course, technology and programming and computer science. There are lots of people who, if given the opportunity and the education exposure, could develop skills in other areas and so on. So I think the reason why that's so important is that, number one, unlike most recessions where you don't know how long the downturn is going to be and how fast things will turn around, in this case, you do know that it is going to be at least a year in which the economy is up against the ropes. And you know that because the serological studies show us what percentage of people have been infected and have recovered so far in the community. And we can see that the growth rate would take a very long time for us to get to herd immunity. It would take us at least a year and a half, if not longer. And from the vaccines that even though they're entering into, some of them are entering into phase 2, we know that takes a period of time before you're through those tests, and then there's manufacturing and distribution and so forth. So you've got this window of time to reinvest with people who are maybe finding it harder to get back into the jobs because not all of them are coming back immediately. So that's point one. Point two is that the value for countries to invest in their human capital and to upskill people will determine how strong the boom is and the growth is post-COVID. Because if you think about the economy being redefined by some of these newer skills and technologies and capabilities, then the more of a productive base of people that you have that can engage in that future economy, that will determine the wealth of nations in this post-COVID world in a way that if you don't have the skill sets, you will not grow as fast. You will not have as strong of an economy, and that pattern will last into that phase 4 for maybe a decade.
And moving on to kind of phases that you mentioned, which in the article are detailed, the phases of recovery. I found there's a 2006 study that was conducted by the European Commission, which looked at the macroeconomic effects of a pandemic in Europe. So they conducted a lot of models to see what the impact would be of a pandemic, drawing a lot of data, especially from the SARS outbreak in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong. They worked off an assumption, which I found quite interesting, that the pandemic would be limited in duration to 1 quarter, and also that it would be synchronized globally. And that was the underlying assumption for their model. Obviously, we're not in that kind of position now. So, as you mentioned just then, how can we ensure can we even ensure there's a kind of unified climb back out? Or is this going to be a very staggered approach for different countries around the world, each pulling themselves out at different rates?
Yeah, it's interesting. My forecast 1.0, which I developed at the end of February, I made the exact opposite assumption, is that the world community would not be able to coordinate a global response. And in fact, even in the United States, the different states and counties would not be able to coordinate a response. And because of that, it would be a prolonged wave of infections and reinfections that would, so I do think it's, that key assumption, you've nailed it, which is that it's, if you assume that we don't cooperate or coordinate as tightly, you pretty much have to develop a plan that's more resilient. So what does that look like? Well, one is that the good news is that the information that is available to people and the data collection is improving. For example, there's this company biobot.io, which I've been following, which is an MIT startup that tests wastewater, sewage. And they were using their technology mainly to detect the levels of opioids because we excrete them, and they found that they could adapt that to detect COVID. So now what you have is you have a technology that in Europe and the United States, in the U.S. it's 75% of the homes are connected to the sewage system. It's even higher in Europe. What you have is you have the ability to automatically detect where infection levels are at. And so adopting technology like that, this is where data really becomes incredibly powerful because it can tell us where we're at in terms of the virus declining or if it's accelerating in the community, and we can then do more for tracing and intervention and testing on a more active way. So I think that foundation, basically each country is going to have to make their own decision, and the better they have a handle on what's going on with the data, I think the easier it is going to be to engage the economy and get that moving. At the same time, most of them have, each of the different countries in Europe and in fact the different states in the United States, they have different ways in which they manage education, and so the decisions about how do you fund upskilling and reskilling will happen at a country or even a regional level. And so I think you've got to make those own decisions and actions and promote as many people making good decisions, because I don't think there's going to be any coordinated action or decision that will move in lockstep across the EU and the US.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think when you mentioned there in terms of so people and consumers and how they might return to form, going by the 4 phases that you highlight here, would you agree that we are now, we're in phase 2 at this point, especially as you mentioned that consumer spending will cautiously return, personal care will start to build up again, but people will still be quite reluctant to return, a rubber band back to how they were before the whole crisis. So are we now in that stage?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're now in phase 2. So we're past that guns, germs, and beer phase, though you may still see sales in those areas. So the phase 2 now is people are beginning to cautiously return and make decisions about what activities they feel are appropriate for their own risk. And as specific examples, what we're seeing in the consumer spending in the United States is that people are being cautious about their spending. They are still afraid that they may lose their job, and so they're pulling back on consumer spending. There's been some new research from credit card companies showing that people are paying down their balances or carrying less credit. Surveys of people about what they've done with their stimulus checks show that about 2/3 of it is being saved, or people are saying they're saving it. Mm-hmm. And so what you've got is even if everything were to go away in terms of the virus overnight, magically, as some people have suggested it might, you still wouldn't have the economy come back the next day, because you've got people who are playing it conservative. And since consumer spending is 2/3 or more of all the developed countries' economies, you've got an issue here where not all the jobs will come back because not all the consumer spending is coming back.
I noted, some of the declines that you mentioned during phase 1, things a 90% decline in air travel, a 27% decline in new car sales, and of course, movie theaters and shopping centers, a 97 and 94% drop. It's been a huge impact, and even here, there's been in the Netherlands from the 1st of June, there's talk of reopening cinemas, restaurants, bars, but some cinemas have already said that it's not economically viable for them to reopen if they're operating at 1/3 capacity, or they have to ensure the 1.5 meter gap between every seat. So as you mentioned, then there's even the practical considerations as well start to mount up as you try to reopen, let alone getting people to part with the money that they've been saving.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the point that you're making is that even as you open things up, if the consumers don't come back, or the rules make it to where the business model is no longer viable, there's going to be a certain percentage of businesses that go out of business, and therefore a certain amount of the workforce that I think is available for retraining and upskilling and a longer term investment. So you've got it exactly right. I mean, all the consumer surveys that we're seeing come through Esomar around how consumer sentiment and what they're doing with their spending are showing that even if you had no restrictions whatsoever, not everyone is returning back to spending in the same way until they can see that their own personal finances are safe. So, and this is where the modern monetary policy becomes quite important, because the signals that central banks are sending and the fiscal stimulus that should be running counter trend, should be investing in infrastructure and so forth. This is going to be important to make up that gap in the consumer spending economy. But you can't fill the gap exactly right, because government spending can build roads and build infrastructure, but it's not so easy to say, hey, let's go fill up all the seats in the restaurant or in the theater. And that's why this change in skills, I think, is quite an important part of the overall solution.
I think that leads quite nicely into to what you described as phase 3, which I really like the phrase. It's a fork in the road. So that is the kind of pivotal point, the point where you make the decision of which industries to back to push your growth. Is it going to be the existing industries like car manufacturers and coal-fired power? Are you looking towards newer, growing, greener, more eco-friendly, or more sustainable industries? And from where we stand at the moment, do you see any indications of which way that will go? Considering just today it's been announced that it's going to be almost €9 billion bailout for Lufthansa in Germany. So on the surface, it seems as if countries are going back to backing the old favorites, backing the old industries.
Yeah, and that's so the problem we have to look at is beyond this crisis and say, what does the next 20 years look like in the world, and therefore what investments do we want to make today to have those next 20 years look effective. And the exercise I often do with executives, just talk about personal coaching, is, hey, what does your life look like in 20 years? And hey, you're this age today, add 20 years, imagine yourself that age, what does your life look like? And then work backwards to say, well, then what choices did you have to make to get there? And I think you do the same thing with governments and economies and say, imagine at your age here, you're living in the economy. What do you want the world around you to look like? And then how do you begin to make the choices and investments to get there? This week in the Arctic Circle, the temperature is in, you'll have to translate to centigrade, but it's really warm. It's warmer than it is in Washington, D.C. this week. And so as a reminder, climate change has not gone away. Cities have gotten a very interesting glimpse at what a world looks like without as much pollution. And my hope is that will encourage them, if they're going to do a cash for clunkers program like they did in the US and in Europe, where they will give you money for your old cars, then help encourage people to trade those in for electric vehicles. Because interestingly, the trend now, because of the pandemic, is not as many people are going to take mass transit. They don't want to. They don't see it as safe. And so they're going to be getting into cars. And so with that as a logical response, maybe we can encourage a faster shift to electrification. There's a lot of examples like that when you go through the economy and say, additive manufacturing, shorter supply chains. What does that look like? And to your point, the bailouts of the airlines is difficult because they're very big parts of the overall economy. But if you think about, I'll take an easier example. Should we be bailing out cruise ships immediately? Maybe we should say, well, maybe the world won't need as many cruise ships for the next several years because people, see them as more dangerous in terms of, biological health outbreaks.
Absolutely. I just want, and on that kind of note, you mentioned public transport then as well, and a point I did want to get your thoughts on is leading back to what you mentioned before, how there's been more outbreaks and more risk to those in lower income categories in the economy. As you move into these future phases where we look back to growth and we look at how to build our way out of this, is there a way that we can ensure that equality increases just as much as growth? So there was a statistic here that I found that between 1980 and 2012, the bottom 90% of US households stagnated in value, flatlined, whereas the top 1% managed to double theirs over the same period. So is there a way that we can avoid repeating that cycle again where, to put it bluntly, the rich get richer and everyone else stays where they are?
Yeah, I think that there's the most important key to that is access to education. Some of the research by Pew showed that areas where you had greater socioeconomic transference from the bottom quintile up to the mid or higher quintiles absolutely have to do with two things. One, access to education, and the other is living in communities where you have more commingling of different socioeconomic groups. And so that second one's hard to deal with because that's where people choose to buy homes, and people have increasingly segregated. And school districts don't always cross those boundaries. That's maybe a harder one to deal with. But access to education from a young age forward is absolutely something that can be addressed. There's also good research that shows that one of the programs was having nurses come into homes for lower income areas and provide more education and support that they might not be getting from their broader extended family, and that can make a big difference. Early start into preschool and fully funded education programs around that, tied in with meal services and programs. So there's a lot of packages we can do to help upward mobility. I mean, I myself am a product of that. My family, I was on welfare in the U.S. as a child. I benefited from school breakfast and lunches, and I went through state school, through university, and now I'm arguably in the top quintile. And my mother was offered a retraining program. She was a waitress in a restaurant. She would be exactly the kind of person that would be displaced. I used to fold napkins in the back of Papa Lorenzo's spaghetti vendor, and we'd get free dinner. I don't think so. I've driven by where it was back when I was a kid to look for it. I think another restaurant taken it over. But that story was she was offered a job or a training program in wastewater, which for a female, single mom, that was, an area dominated by about 90% males. And, she learned to drive a backhoe and dig trenches. And, she worked her way up to where she was eventually running the wastewater treatment plant and had a very successful career. That was in many ways created because there was a path to get out of welfare through training and education, and she took advantage of it. So I think more programs like that are beneficial, and unfortunately, the pace of technology is such that you really do, for many paths to higher income, you really do need more education. It's harder and harder to do that without that skill and access to education.
And speaking of technology, that leads right into the next question that I had noted down here, which is looking at which technologies in your mind do you think provide the key to a more prosperous or a more secure economy in future? And you already mentioned one previously, which is the increase in people working from home, as we are both doing right now. Do you think this is a change that is going to stick? I think it was Jacinda Ardern recently in New Zealand has already been pushing for the idea of the 4-day working week. Are we looking at more remote work, people being more distanced as a way to embrace technology as a driver of the future?
Yeah, there's a really interesting economist from Ireland. Nick Williams is his last name. He has a podcast which is, I think, quite popular as well. But his argument was that what really has caused the most economic dislocation is deflation, not inflation. And he points back to Germany in post World War I and what gave rise to Nazism and so forth as actually being the deflationary pressure that occurred prior to the inflationary run. And his point is that technology and what's coming out of Silicon Valley is driving greater efficiencies, and those have a general deflationary pressure to them. And so the interesting point about how do you navigate through that this world of greater and greater automation and technology, on the one hand, is really great because wealth from multi-factor productivity generally does get more broadly distributed. If you go back to Frederick Taylor and his coal shoveling experiments and the birth of scientific management, it is absolutely clear that that created a lot more wealth for the owners of the businesses, but much of that wealth also came down to workers because it took fewer workers to accomplish the same task. They had to have more skill, and they were paid more because of that. And so, I think the puzzle that we have to solve is how do we, engage in technologies that are more in line with the future that we want, which hopefully will be less carbon intensive and in better balance for the planet, and at the same time make sure that the productivity and the gains that are happening that can create some deflationary pressures are offset with enough expansion in new opportunities. That's not an easy balance, but it definitely only works if you have an increasingly educated workforce that is able to find a place when robots or automation take over some of those jobs and some of those roles.
Yeah, and it's interesting because doing some research, I came across some discussion by Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee, who are both based at MIT, who actually argued that technology drives inequality by better rewarding those who are better educated. And as you mentioned previously, it diverts income to those who own the companies as opposed to employees. So you get these kind of superstar names, people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who reap immense personal reward from these advances in technology. And is there a way that you think that would filter down especially when talking about things like AI and automation, which on the surface are going to be taking jobs away from people? How can we ensure that that benefit is still felt throughout society?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that there's no question that the wealthiest, the most wealth creation is happening from the entrepreneurs that create the business. But if you look at Amazon and you look at Facebook and you look at some of these other or Tesla, the number of millionaires that it has created from people who have gotten stock options and participated in that growth, it is quite there's quite a broad wake created by that entrepreneur's boat that cuts through the water and builds a new business model. So I do think that the Silicon Valley idea that everybody in the company owns part of the company is a very important way of democratizing the benefit. The other one is, we're certainly going to see, I think, the pledge that many of the entrepreneurs make to give back a large share of their wealth, as people like Bill Gates have done, and so forth. That's a very important cultural norm for us to reiterate and emphasize, especially in the top percent. If you are listening to this podcast and you have the ability to engage in your local food bank or an education program or mentorship program in your community and so forth, I think we all have that responsibility to figure out how to give back. My son and I created a program for Reno to help kids learn to code starting in elementary school. And each year we give a prize, and fortunately Microsoft has partnered up, and they split the check that we write to invest in that program. And my son goes out and teaches kids how to code, and even adults how to code. And so, whatever your skill is, or your capability is, or your calling is, I think it's incredibly important that we give back because you're absolutely right. The technology accelerates the ability to create wealth. Now, what's exciting about that is if you look at those lists of those people who are the wealthiest people, most of them are first generation wealth, right? They created that wealth because they had a really interesting idea, and it just happens to be in our modern infrastructure. If you have a good idea, it can become global and billions of people can be using it, and you make a fair amount of money that way. But we've got to have a way and a cultural norm of giving back in a much more significant way. And of course, there'll be tax policy issues and other strategies for how do you distribute some of those benefits and scale those benefits more broadly. Yeah, there's a lot we need to do on that area, I think.
And I think in terms of having, of course, the education and the time important as a resource to, develop these ideas, to build these multi-billion-dollar companies in future, there has to be that initial investment of brain power, which, not everyone can have when they're still concerned with working a 9 to 5 and making sure that there's food on the table. And I just wanted to touch back on something else that Eric Brynjolfsson said, which he had an idea for a digital Athens, as he puts it, which is something that AI could eventually provide the basis for, a culture much like ancient Athens, where the citizens had time for art, leisure, and democracy, because then the work was done by slaves, but of course we're in a much more civilized time now, so we use automation or use AI. Do you think that is a future that we can look to as we work more with AI? Is there going to be more time for people to work on these bigger picture ideas when the day-to-day is more taken care of?
Yeah, that promise of that leisure class and technology, I think, has been the carrot dangled in front of society for about 100 years. I think that I think you're better off incentivizing people. For example, part of the overall package should be incentivizing more people to start their own businesses. I was part of a group called the Entrepreneurs Organization, which is a global organization with about 15,000 members. And what was surprising to me is about a third of the people were not, their businesses were not, technology and requiring PhDs and so forth. They were some of them were blue collar type, roll up your sleeves and you can build a business and make some wealth. So I do think that it's important to encourage. I think you're more likely to see the outcome where you have more people encouraged to pursue their passions and their interests or their knowledge set to create a business and create some value and create some jobs for other people than you are to think that technology and those opportunities will create people who now have a leisure class and can stay at home more. And it's not to say that that's an impossible outcome. It's just that I've been looking at that technology productivity concept that since I came out of college, which was the idea that with this increased productivity, a portion of that productivity can come back to you in the time of more leisure time. Maybe it will happen. I think that doing a 4-day work week is a great way of that happening, because let's recall that when you go back to the 1918 pandemic, the average work week was 6 days a week. So the fact that we have a 5-day work week is already progress. And if we can get down to a 4-day work week, great. I think that's I think that's probably the best way.
I think it's a very glass half full way of looking at the situation. So I had a quote that I found, which is going to sound very, coffee shop intellectual, from Voltaire, which was that work keeps at bay 3 great evils: boredom, vice, and need. And that was his argument for making sure that we all continue with our day to day, because otherwise we're all going to fall into to boredom and vice. So it's
and maybe this pandemic staying at home is actually a very good, I think, wake up call for some, because it does cause us to focus our mind and say, what are we doing? I mean, obviously, the alcohol consumption has gone way up during people staying at home, and I think the sense of time becomes a little bit. Hey, what day of the week it is? What am I supposed to be doing? There's a lot of things.
I can relate to that entirely.
Yeah, right. So there is something. I mean, I think that there is something. I mean, I go back to my mother's story about her, being on welfare and then getting retrained for a period of time, and that gave her more of a sense of purpose and focus and a sense of self-worth. And so I think in at least the way that the economic norms and mores are now, work does give us a sense of purpose and value. And so I think trying to create more work and more opportunities for meaningful work for people is a social good for us all to invest in. I do hope with your vision, or that idea coming out of MIT and a few other places, that we should be able to get a leisure dividend from all of our technology, and that could be a counterbalance to some of the deflationary effects by taking some labor out of the system by adding another 4-day work week. I think that's a good long-term goal or solution. But in the short term, I think we've got to focus on how do we create paths to meaningful work for people that can help them take care of that last vice, the need, from Voltaire's quote.
Absolutely. And to kind of pull things back to your work and your kind of day to day, coming from the research and insights background, and with the research that you've been conducting, over the course of the crisis as well, how do you think the industry overall, the industry that Esomar is representing as well, should be engaging with legislators or with other sectors of the economy to prepare for the future that you've outlined? So prepare for these phases of recovery.
Yeah, well, the first thing is that we're doing a really exciting program at Esomar to build a shared research commons database. We're doing it with other research organizations like the ARF, and it's a place where if you see news stories that have data points, or you have tracking research or data collection, you can share that into this database and code that up very easily. And if you want access, hopefully there'll be an email contact from me, and I can get people hooked up to that. But that's creating a data commons so that we can be faster and better about sharing data and information about different trends. And we've got data from McKinsey and Ipsos and ComScore and the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and lots of information coming in there already. So engage in that, because I think the lesson from the Great Depression was that they didn't have enough data and they didn't have enough information fast enough to know what was going on in the economy. And so that's why we have GDP and all these other great measures today. But today, I think arguably you can say that the market research industry, with its $80 billion in global investment each year, has so much to offer back to each other, to business planners, and to governments about where the trends in the economy are heading. The second one, we're going to write a series of articles based upon some of that data on where we think some of the economic forecasts are pointing, and share that with some of the large trade associations, and have that be, again, an open, published piece of information that people can use and adapt and update, because I think the better idea we have of where the economy is going, the faster we'll get to recovery.
Fantastic. And I think, as you mentioned then as well, with the sector being able to offer, 100 years ago, they were relying on estimates, they were relying on guesswork almost to arrive at these figures of GDP, whereas now we have much more real-time access to actual granular information that can give a much greater level of insight and a much greater accuracy in terms of predictions that you can offer.
You've got it. Yes.
Fantastic. Well, Rex, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, of course, to anyone who's been listening in as well. I hope you've learned something new, gotten some interesting perspectives on the current global crisis. And I hope, of course, all our listeners will join us again next time. Rex, once again, thank you so much for taking part today.
Shrikar, thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
From all of us at Esomar, we hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and, of course, stay curious. Thank you all, and we hope to see you again next time.